Well, I just want to begin by welcoming you to our Good Friday service. Glad that you have joined us this morning for this time together, this time of reflection on what it is that Jesus has done for us. If you're a guest with us today, let me just say a special welcome to you. Glad that you joined us this morning for this time together. This is Good Friday. And this is actually one of those uneasy days on the calendar that many people don't quite know what to do with it. When you stop to think about it, when you stop to think about what it is that we remember and reflect on this day, it does seem like Good Friday is a contradiction of terms. Good Friday is the day that we set aside to reflect upon the suffering and death of Jesus. And Good Friday is unlike any other day on the calendar. Now, there are lots of holidays, lots of events that commemorate individuals' lives and even deaths, and we've just come through a run of them. I mean, we had Valentine's Day, which commemorates Saint Valentine, who was apparently martyred because he performed weddings for soldiers who were forbidden to marry at the time. We had St. Patrick's Day, which celebrates St. Patrick, who took the gospel and brought it to Ireland. There's lots of holidays like that. The third Monday in January in the States is celebrated as Martin Luther King Day, to commemorate the birthday of Martin Luther King, the leader of the civil rights movement who was assassinated. So there are lots of holidays that commemorate the lives and even the deaths of particular individuals, but there is nothing like Good Friday with its exclusive focus on the suffering and death of Jesus. And that's what we're doing today. We're focusing our attention on it. Now, if Good Friday is all about the suffering and death of Jesus, then the name Good Friday does sound like an oxymoron or a contradiction of terms. But I think the name Good Friday is actually a very fitting name for this day because there are, in fact, several contradictions associated with Good Friday. So I want to draw your attention back to this passage of Scripture from the book of Isaiah, the one that we read in a responsive reading this morning. The prophet Isaiah lived and prophesied during the 8th century BC, but he spoke about the coming of the Messiah, or the Messiah who was to come. And everything that he said was fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. So we're going to look at this passage that begins at the end of Isaiah chapter 52 and continues to the end of Isaiah chapter 53. In many ways, it's a familiar passage, and we've tried to kind of weave it through what we're doing here this morning. But I want to walk you through it now by highlighting for you 4 of Good Friday's contradictions. Chapter 52 ends with these words: "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and he shall be exalted. As many as were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been heard or told, then they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand." Isaiah is speaking about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Jesus, and the first contradiction he highlights is that the Messiah will be repulsive but redemptive. Isaiah says that many will be astonished at his appearance because his appearance will be so marred even beyond human semblance. And this, in fact, is what Jesus endured on the cross. In the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul wrote these words, which may well have been part of an ancient hymn. He said, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." And that last line reminds us that it wasn't just that Jesus died that was significant, but the way that he died was significant. And it's good for us to think about the horror of the cross. Jesus died a violent death. In a span of less than 24 hours, Jesus endured as many as 6 different interrogations, and during this time, he was blindfolded, stripped, punched, kicked, spit on, and ridiculed. They dressed him in royal clothes, they pressed a thorny crown onto his head, and they mocked him openly. And we actually know quite a bit about the practice of crucifixion as it was done in the Roman Empire. First came the floggings. The usual instrument was a short whip with several leather thongs of various lengths, in which small iron balls and pieces of sheep bone were tied at intervals. And for scourging, the man was stripped of his clothing. His hands were tied to an upright post. The back, buttocks, and legs were flogged either by 2 soldiers or by one who just alternated positions. The severity of the scourging depended upon the disposition of the soldiers. It was intended to take the victim to a state just short of collapse or death. After the scourging, the soldiers would taunt their victims. And as the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions. The leather thongs and sheep bones would cut into the skin and the tissues. Then as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal system or muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss would set the stage for circulatory shock. The extent of blood loss may well have determined how long the victim would survive on the cross. The severe scourging that Jesus would have undergone, the appreciable blood loss that he would have experienced, would have left him in a pre-shock state. The physical and mental abuse that was meted out by the Romans, as well as the lack of food, water, and sleep, would have contributed to his generally weakened state. So even before the actual crucifixion, Jesus' physical condition was at least serious and possibly critical. Isaiah says his appearance was marred beyond human semblance. You could not recognize him. The actual crucifixion itself is one of the most brutal forms of execution ever devised. With his entire weight supported by the nails in his hands and in his feet, Jesus would have died an excruciating death by asphyxiation. The cross was a brutal display of power on the part of the Romans. One scholar described it this way. He said, crucifixion was supposed to be seen by as many people as possible. Debasement resulting from public agony was a chief feature of the method, along with the prolonging of agony. It was a form of advertisement or public announcement. This person is the scum of the earth, not fit to live, more like an insect than a human being. The crucified wretch was pinned up like a specimen. Crosses were not placed out in the open for convenience or sanitation, but for maximum public exposure. His appearance was marred beyond human semblance. And yet, for all the horror of the cross, for all of the repulsion that is spoken of here, these verses speak about a type of redemption. Verse 13 says, "So shall he sprinkle many nations." So what does that mean? Well, the word that's translated sprinkle there is found 22 times in the Old Testament, and it is associated with setting something apart or making it holy, hallowing an item or cleansing an item so that it's fit for service. It's used to refer to making atonement for something. And this is one of the ironies of Good Friday, that salvation should come out of such intense suffering. This, Isaiah says, is what makes kings shut their mouths and be silent. That salvation should come about through a cross, would have been the least likely plan that anyone could come up with. The cross was an object of horror. The Jews considered anyone who hung upon a cross to be cursed by God. This is what ought to make people sit up and take notice. This is not the usual way people think about salvation. As one writer pointed out, Caesar ruled by putting others on the cross. Jesus ruled by putting himself on the cross. He was repulsive, but redemptive. Second contradiction of Good Friday is that the Messiah is revealed, but rejected. And we see this in the first 3 verses of chapter 53, where it says, "Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not." So verse 1 begins by asking 2 questions. Who has believed our report is the first question. And the implied answer seems to be that the message itself, the words themselves, are not enough to convince people, so God chose to reveal himself. And what it says specifically is that the arm of the Lord is revealed. Now that phrase, the arm of the Lord, is a reference to God's power. So if the rock rolls up his shirt sleeves and exposes his arm, it displays his power at once. I mean, you look at that and say, look, I don't think that's someone I want to mess with. The gun show itself is enough to convince you he's got great power. But God reveals his arm, his power, in a totally different way. The question the verse asks is, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Well, the answer is actually given earlier in Isaiah 52, where it says, "The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God." So to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? To all nations, to all people. This is what the coming of Jesus into the world has done. It has revealed the arm of the Lord. But what Isaiah is saying is that the arm of the Lord doesn't look like what we would have expected it to look like. We expected the gun show. We expected the raw display of power. But what we got was something different. So Isaiah goes on to say, "He grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." Jesus didn't look like the Messiah people would have expected. Now, I know that artists throughout the centuries have tried to paint Jesus as handsome and muscular, but there was nothing about his physical appearance that would have drawn people to him. Isaiah's words are, he was like a root out of dry ground. You just look at it and think, nothing good could possibly come out of that. I mean, isn't that the way Jesus' life went? When you read through the Gospels, isn't that what you find? That people often misjudged him on the basis of appearance? Wasn't one of the very first questions people asked at the beginning of his ministry was, he's from Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can anything good possibly come out of this dry root out of the ground? Here's the way John describes the incarnation of Jesus in John chapter 1. He says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." And John is simply confirming what Isaiah predicted. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. and most fully so on the cross. He was revealed but rejected. The third contradiction of Good Friday is that he was innocent but executed. And we see this in the section that runs from verse 4 down to verse 9. I'll read it for you again. It says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. He was innocent but executed. Jesus lived a sinless life. He was the only one who could ever claim innocence before God. And the Gospels highlight Jesus' innocence before his accusers. In Luke 23, we read this account. It says, "Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, 'You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing deserving death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him.' But the whole crowd shouted, 'Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us.' Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' For the third time he spoke to them. 'Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him.' But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Jesus' innocence is repeatedly highlighted by Luke, and yet he was crucified. In fact, Jesus was crucified between two criminals. As Isaiah says, they made his grave with the wicked. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. So how can that be? And how can that possibly be good? Well, verses 4 and 5 give us the answer, that he has borne our griefs. He's carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. He was executed because of our sin. He took our penalty. This is what makes Good Friday good. Now, not everyone sees it that way, but it is the only way to understand Good Friday. John Stott put it memorably when he said, "Before we can see the cross as something done for us, we have to see it as something done by us." And what we remember on Good Friday is that it was our sin that put Jesus on the cross. He was innocent but executed. The fourth contradiction of Good Friday is that he was crushed but victorious. And this is what we see in verses 10 to 12. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. And what we learn in these verses is that what happened to Jesus was not an accident. Verse 10 tells us, in fact, that it was the will of the Lord to crush him. Now, the crucifixion of Jesus was a gruesome event. I gave you some of the details already. There's no whitewashing it or sugarcoating it to make it more palatable. Crucifixion was one of the worst forms of execution ever devised. And on the cross, Jesus endured the wrath of sinful man. But the real horror of the cross was not the wrath of man that Jesus endured. It was the fact that he endured the wrath of God. God's just wrath against our sin was placed on Jesus. And Jesus' death on the cross was God's solution to the sin problem that plagues humanity. Sin had to be paid for, and God decreed that it would be paid for with the substitutionary death of Jesus, the spotless lamb, sacrificed on our behalf. The book of Acts describes God's sovereignty over the crucifixion with these words. Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. All of those forces were marshaled together against Jesus. But then it goes on to say, they did what your power and your will had decided beforehand should happen. The death of Jesus upon the cross was the only way that our sin could adequately be atoned for. He was crushed. But the passage doesn't end with the suffering servant being crushed. Now, it's important for us to spend time reflecting on the horrors of what happened on that first Good Friday. It's important for us not to rush past the events of Jesus' betrayal and his arrest, his beatings and his crucifixion. I know that it's customary to have a little more somber tone to our Good Friday gatherings, but I also think it's important to remember that Good Friday is not the end. On Sunday morning, we will come back and we will gather together to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, that the grave could not hold him. But these verses give us a glimpse of that already. These verses go on to say that the suffering servant's days will be prolonged. He will see what he's accomplished, and he will be satisfied in it. And then it picks up on a common military image to say that God will divide the spoils of victory with him. And that picture is actually of us. We are the spoils of the victory, those redeemed by the suffering of the Messiah. And this passage ends by saying this in verse 12. Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Notice that it says not just that he made intercession for the transgressors, but that he makes intercession for the transgressors. Because the grave could not hold him, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, making intercession for you and for me. That's what makes Good Friday good. Here's how the writer of Hebrews puts it. I'll close with this. As he evaluates all that happened in the Old Testament, everything leading up to the time of Jesus, he says, now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office, but because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. That's the good news of Good Friday.